Where did you attend school? What was your schooling before you went into the military service?
My schooling was in Albany, New York, and I graduated from Albany High School in 1942.
Okay.
Yeah.
Where were you, and what was your reaction when you heard about Pearl Harbor? What had happened at Pearl Harbor?
I was at home. It was on a Sunday. I lived on Upper 2nd Street at the time. And the news came over the radio while I was doing my homework, which was a no-no in those days. And I was really upset because we didn't know what would happen and what was going to happen to the families. And I told my parents that the news had just come over the radio, and of course they were nervous and upset too.
Mm-hmm.
I was drafted into the U.S. Army.
Okay. Where did you receive your basic training?
My basic training was at Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri, and this was in 1943.
Could you tell us about your training? What kind of, did you receive any specialty training, or?
I was trained basically with the Engineer Corps, and our training included rifle range practice, and we had hikes and the short, what do you call it, close order drills. We had all of our shots and things, and prepared us to go overseas. We were not trained as a combat unit, but we were trained as a support unit. The 1084th Engineer Utility Detachment was what I was assigned to.
Okay. How did you stay in the United States for very long, or did you go overseas directly after boot camp?
I was in the United States for a very short time before being sent to Fort Claiborne, Louisiana, where I joined my permanent unit, which was the 1084th Engineers. And from there, we prepared to ship overseas.
How did you get overseas?
From Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, we took a troop train. We were boarded aboard a troop train and taken across the country to California, San Francisco. Fort Stoneman was the port of embarkation, and we were there a very short length of time before we were put aboard a troop ship. The New Amsterdam, which was a converted passenger liner. We sailed under the San Francisco Gate Bridge, and we're on our way for 42 days. And we didn't know where we were going, but we stopped at various ports on the way. We stopped in New Zealand and Australia and in Columbus, Ceylon. I think it's Sierra Lanka today. And then we went through the Indian Ocean into the Red Sea and on into Egypt. And we disembarked at Suez in Egypt on the canal. Yes, we did. We had the King Neptune ceremony, and that was quite enjoyable. And I believe it was more enjoyable because the commanding officer got dumped in a pool, I believe. So that was all part of it. And, we had church services aboard the liner, and a lot of drills, because this liner went over unescorted. That was rather nerve-wracking. And at night, there was no light showing. All the portholes were covered. And the only protection we had was anti-aircraft fire and depth charges that could be launched over the side. But fortunately, there were no incidents on the way. The anxiety was mainly where were we going, which we didn't know until we hit the Red Sea going into Egypt. So,
okay, what did you do once you reached Egypt?
Once we reached, the first thing we did was had a inspection. We had to stand for inspection. And then we had to develop a campsite on the desert outside of Suez. And that involved masons and carpenters putting down a cement platform and 2x4 framework for our tents. And then we were assigned various duties in construction in that area and nearby areas.
Could you explain or tell us about some of your duties?
My duties at one point were mostly in the electrical end. I worked in a warehouse, an electrical warehouse, and at one point some of my unit were moved to a commando base on the Mediterranean coast, which had to be dismantled because it was no longer in use. The invasion of southern Italy had begun, and they didn't need this anymore, so we had to take these bases down and load all the equipment and things on trucks, which would be recycled then, the materials and the equipment. And that was one of my duties. At one point, I was shipped to Dakar in West Africa, and that meant a plane ride up the coast of Africa, stopping at Libya and Algeria and Tunisia and so forth. It told when we went over that we had to be very careful about fraternization with the population. Although they were not openly hostile, they still favored the Axis powers, and we did that. When we had time off, we would visit Cairo, Egypt, and Alexandria. We couldn't go into Suez, where we were stationed initially, because of bubonic plague. That was never open to us. But we could go into Port Said, which was on the canal. And we basically kept to ourselves. We would go into cafes and go into these bazaar areas and buy gifts for home. We would ride on the back of an army truck. They were moving supplies around, and we sat on top of these trucks and would be transported to the Egyptian cities. And these excursions would usually just extend 2 days.
Okay. I guess then your next assignment was in Dakar?
Yes, we flew down the coast and down the west coast of Africa, which would be on the Atlantic Ocean side, and refueling, as I mentioned, several places on the way. The last place we refueled was way out in the desert, and there was just a little gas station and a few tents. And then we went on to Dakar, where there was an airfield and roads in construction at that time. And I was assigned to work in a power plant, which was a diesel fired generator, electric generator, on shifts. And that is where I met my fate, my injuries. I was working alone at the time on a night shift, and I had some gasoline had got on my shirt, and somehow it was ignited by changing a battery. I got a spark, and I was put on fire. And they thought at this time I probably should be shipped back home for treatment, which was a wise thought. So at that time I was loaded on a plane with other injured and flown back to Casablanca in Morocco. And there, after being stabilized, they put me aboard a Liberty ship, the Robert Dale Owen, I believe was the name of the ship. And we were transported back to the States in a huge convoy. I don't know how many ships were involved, but it was from horizon to horizon practically. And occasionally depth charges would have to be discharged from the ships because of submarine activity. And we were probably about 10 days en route back to the States. And just before we entered port, about a day before, we had news that the Axis powers had surrendered. And that was a joyful news. And then we landed in Newport News in Virginia. And from there I began my trips to hospitals and recuperation. And I don't know, from there I was sent to Rhodes General, is this relevant? Rhodes General Hospital in Utica, New York, for evaluation of my wounds. And the doctors determined that I needed skin grafting on my right hand. And to do this, I had to go to Valley Forge General Hospital in Pennsylvania. I believe it's near Pottstown. And there were a lot of burn cases were coming in from soldiers injured in tanks where they would catch fire. And they did skin grafting on my wrist, hand, and fingers on my right hand. And there were 2 operations there, and then I was sent for rest and recuperation to Lake Placid, New York for several days, a weekend, and then sent to Atlantic City for reassignment. At that point, the Army figured I was going to be useful to them for a while, since the Japanese were still engaged in war with us. So I was assigned to Fort Dix in New Jersey, where they were receiving veterans to be discharged. And my job there was as a record clerk. I was a T5 corporal at that point and had a small crew working with me in recording things that had to go on the surface records, such as the soldiers' shots and the date of entry back into the U.S. and so forth.
And how long did you do that?
I did that until we got the joyful news that the Japanese had surrendered. The A-bombs had been dropped, and the Japanese had capitulated, and we celebrated. We figured that was about it for us. We would soon be discharged. They did the discharging on the basis of points, so much for service, so much for overseas time, and so on. And I was discharged in I believe, 1946. And I had all my records taken care of right there where I was working, and loaded aboard a bus that took me to the Port Authority in New York City. And from there I got a cab to Grand Central Station, took a ride up the Hudson River, the beautiful Hudson, and home in Albany, New York. And that was basically the end of my service.
Okay. Did you make use of the GI Bill after?
I did. I got the eligibility certificate under the GI Bill, and I went to work to learn the hardware business. And there was a hardware store in Albany, New York, in the South End. And there I learned how many items they had and what they were and how to sell them and how to stock them, and it was very interesting. And I did that until a short return to high school. I wanted to pick up some subject that I missed before graduation, and I did that. And later I met my beautiful wife here, and we were married and raised a family, 10 children.
Wow. Did you join any veterans organizations?
I did. I joined 3 or 4. One was the American Legion for a while, and Catholic War Veterans. The Veterans of Foreign Wars was another one. And currently I'm in the Disabled American Veterans. I've been in that for over 20 years. I'm a life member.
Does the group you belong to, does it have any reunions, or have you kept in contact with anyone?
Well, I did keep in contact with some of my friends and buddies from overseas for quite a while. I believe they're all deceased now, but I never went to any reunions. I was never really aware of any. I would read in the paper where certain reunions were held, but I never saw our company involved with that. So I just assumed that they weren't reuniting for any reason.
How do you think your military service affected your life?
Well, I think it made me grow up somewhat. I mean, as a 19-year-old going into service, I was not too mature at that point, I don't think. I mean, I had a lot of things to work out. And the discipline, I think, helped me a lot, military discipline, and it taught me how to work and working shifts, and to be responsible for what I was doing because others depended on me for that. And basically, I think it made me a better citizen, and I was glad for it. Eventually, in hindsight.
Now you brought some things in.
I did.
Would you want to? I'm going to take the cover off this so
Oh,
we can see
okay.
it a little better.
Mm-hmm. I'll put this over here.
Yes. I can put some.
There we go.
Okay.
All right. Okay, what we're looking at here is the U.S. Army blouse, which was worn when we were dressed up on parade or going home on a furlough. And this was the last grade I had was T5, technician, corporal. The U.S. Army insignia. And this is also United States Great Seal here. This indicated the discharge from service. And
What about this patch? What is this patch?
Okay, this patch was indicated the Middle Eastern Theater in Northern Africa. That's what we wore.
And how about the one on the other?
And this was the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers.
Okay, and this patch on your...
This patch was worn after I returned, and I was assigned to the Quartermaster Corps in Fort Dix, New Jersey. That's where I did the record work. This was a Good Conduct Medal, American Theater, and this was a, I'm not sure. The one was a Middle Eastern Theater, and this was the Victory Medal. And that's what they are. This was the Good Conduct, and this was the Victory Medal.
The green one be either the Africa or the China, Burma, India.
This one?
I think that.
Yeah. Okay. Did you have any other papers with you? I thought you brought some other with you too.
Yes, I did.
there any
I don't want to get disconnected here. Let's see. Could you make copies
Yes, we could.
of this? My father was quite a writer in his day. He loved to write letters, and that was his job in the steel company. So he did the writing to the newspapers, and the pictures are of me after I was wounded and home, and my friends, some of my friends here. That's my sister and my father. And these two are my friends. He later went in the Navy too with his brother here. So, and then the back there's others.
Okay.
You have a picture of how I looked on the desert with my desert hat. Okay.
I'll make copies of all of these too.
This was another picture which I would like to keep for my children.
We'll just make copies.
This is me in Alexandria, Egypt, in 1943, I believe. Okay, and this is my discharge. I don't know if you want to see that.
We'll make copies of these.
And this is the military work list.
Okay.
And this is just a copy of the discharge, one side of it. And this is the part of my passport. I think there are 2 sheets there of the passport. You can keep those, and
You sure?
unless you wanted to make your own from here. This is the same thing.
We'll just keep them and put them in the folder. Okay, we'll put these.
Yeah,
in the folder.
that basically is.
And we'll make copies of these
Great.
things.
This is
Okay.
my dog tag.
Ah.
Maybe you could keep that if you wanted to with the
Oh,
uniform.
you
there.
sure? Now,
I don't think anybody would want it. I don't think they're going to put it on me.
Before you do that, because with 10 children and how many grandchildren?
25, I believe, the latest count, right, 25.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the interview. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. You're welcome.